The morning sun cast long shadows across the naval training facility as Lieutenant Jake Morrison strutted across the concrete yard, his boots clicking with military precision. At 28, he had earned his rank through a combination of natural leadership and an iron-fisted approach that had made him both respected and feared among the recruits. His jaw was set in its usual stern expression as he surveyed the group of new trainees assembled before him. Among the sea of nervous faces stood Sarah Chen, a 25-year-old woman whose petite frame and quiet demeanor made her appear almost fragile, next to the towering male recruits surrounding her. Her dark hair was pulled back in a regulation bun, and her uniform hung loosely on her small shoulders. To most observers, she looked like someone who had wandered into the wrong place at the wrong time. Morrison's eyes swept over the group with practiced efficiency until they landed on Sarah. His expression hardened as he took in her appearance, his mind already forming judgments about her capabilities. In his experience, women in the military were either trying to prove something or were simply taking up space that could be better filled by stronger, more capable men. "Listen up, recruits." Morrison's voice boomed across the training ground, causing several of the newer trainees to straighten instinctively. "You think you're here to play games, but I'm here to tell you that this is where boys become men, and where the weak get weeded out. Some of you clearly don't belong here, and it won't take long for me to figure out who needs to go home to mommy." His eyes lingered on Sarah as he spoke those last words, the implication clear to everyone present. Sarah felt the weight of his stare but kept her expression neutral, her hands clasped behind her back in perfect military posture. She had faced this kind of skepticism before, and she knew that reacting emotionally would only confirm whatever preconceptions he already held. The training session began with basic physical exercises, and Morrison made it his personal mission to push Sarah harder than the others. When the group was ordered to do push-ups, he stood directly over her, counting with exaggerated slowness and criticizing her form with unnecessary harshness. When they moved to combat drills, he paired her with the largest and strongest recruits, clearly hoping to see her fail. But Sarah didn't fail. Despite her small stature, she moved with a fluid grace that spoke of extensive training. Her punches were precise, her defensive maneuvers calculated, and her endurance seemed limitless. Other recruits began to notice that while they were struggling to keep up, she appeared to be holding back, as if the exercises were beneath her current skill level. Morrison, however, interpreted her competence as defiance. He had expected her to crumble under pressure, to cry or quit, or at least show some sign that she recognized her place in his hierarchy. Instead, she met every challenge with quiet determination, never complaining, never showing weakness, and never giving him the satisfaction of seeing her break. As the day progressed, Morrison's frustration grew. During a particularly intense drill involving obstacle courses, he began to single Sarah out more aggressively. He criticized her technique, questioned her commitment, and made increasingly personal remarks about her suitability for military service. The other recruits watched uncomfortably as the confrontation escalated, sensing that something more than standard military training was taking place. "Chen," Morrison barked as Sarah completed the obstacle course for the third time that afternoon. "Your time is pathetic. I've seen grandmothers move faster than you. Maybe you should consider a nice desk job somewhere where you won't get real soldiers killed." Sarah's jaw tightened almost imperceptibly, but she maintained her composure. "Yes, sir. I'll work harder, sir." "Work harder?" Morrison stepped closer, his voice dripping with contempt. "You think this is about working harder? This is about natural ability, something you clearly lack. You're weak, Chen. You're a liability waiting to happen." The training yard had grown quiet as other instructors and recruits stopped their activities to watch the confrontation unfold. Morrison was crossing lines that everyone could see, but his rank and reputation made intervention risky. Sarah stood at attention, taking each verbal assault without flinching, but those watching closely could see the controlled tension in her muscles. "I've seen your type before," Morrison continued, now pacing in front of her like a predator circling its prey. "You think because the military has quotas to fill, you can just waltz in here and expect special treatment. Well, let me tell you something, sweetheart. In the real world, the enemy won't care about your feelings or your gender. They'll tear you apart, and when that happens, you'll get good soldiers killed trying to save your worthless hide." Sarah's hands remained clasped behind her back, but her knuckles had gone white with the force of her grip. Still, she said nothing. understanding that any response would only escalate the situation further. She had endured worse than verbal abuse, had faced real enemies in real combat situations that Morrison couldn't even imagine, but she couldn't reveal that truth without compromising everything she had worked for. Morrison mistook her silence for submission and felt emboldened to push further. He had broken tougher recruits than this with his words alone, and he was confident that she was on the verge of cracking. In his mind, he was doing everyone a favor by exposing her weakness now rather than allowing her to fail when lives were on the line. "Look at her," he said, addressing the other recruits while keeping his eyes fixed on Sarah. "This is what failure looks like. This is what happens when political correctness overrides common sense. She doesn't belong here and everyone knows it except her." The afternoon sun was beginning to set, casting the training facility in golden light that seemed to mock the darkness of the situation unfolding. Sarah continued to stand at attention, her breathing steady and controlled despite the verbal onslaught. Inside, however, something was building, not anger or hurt, but a cold calculation that came from years of training that Morrison couldn't possibly understand. As the confrontation reached its peak, none of the observers could have predicted what would happen next. The stage was set for a collision between Morrison's prejudices and a reality he was completely unprepared to face. The next morning brought with it a thick fog that rolled in from the ocean, shrouding the naval facility in an eerie silence. Sarah had spent the night in the barracks listening to the whispered conversations of her fellow recruits as they discussed the previous day's confrontation. Some expressed sympathy for her situation, while others seemed to agree with Morrison's assessment. She had faced such divided opinions before, and had learned to draw strength from her own convictions rather than seek validation from others. Morrison arrived at the training facility earlier than usual, his mood even darker than the previous day. The confrontation with Sarah had left him feeling unsatisfied, as if he hadn't quite achieved the victory he had been seeking. In his mind, she should have been broken by now, should have submitted to his authority or simply quit and saved everyone the trouble. Her continued presence felt like a personal challenge to his methods and his worldview. The morning's training was scheduled to include hand-to-hand combat exercises, a prospect that filled Morrison with anticipation. He had designed the session specifically with Sarah in mind, planning to use it as the final demonstration of her unsuitability for military service. He had carefully selected her sparring partners from among the largest and most aggressive male recruits, confident that the physical reality of combat would accomplish what his words had failed to achieve. As the recruits assembled in the combat training area, Morrison took his position at the center of the mat, his presence commanding immediate attention. The facility's combat area was surrounded by mirrors and equipped with various training weapons and protective gear. The morning light filtered through high windows, creating dramatic shadows that seemed to emphasize the serious nature of what was about to unfold. "Today we focus on real combat situations," Morrison announced, his voice carrying clearly through the humid air. "In the field, you won't have the luxury of choosing your opponents based on size or strength. The enemy comes in all forms, and you need to be prepared to face whatever threat presents itself." His eyes found Sarah in the group, and a cold smile played at the corners of his mouth. "Chen, front and center. Since you seem so confident in your abilities, let's see how you handle yourself against someone who can actually fight back." Sarah stepped forward without hesitation, her movements controlled and precise. She had anticipated this moment, understanding that Morrison's frustration with her would eventually lead to a physical confrontation. As she took her position on the mat, she could feel the eyes of every person in the facility focused on her, waiting to see whether she would finally reveal the weakness that Morrison was so certain existed. Morrison selected her opponent carefully, Rodriguez, a heavily muscled recruit who stood nearly 6 feet tall and outweighed Sarah by at least 60 pounds. Rodriguez looked uncomfortable with the matchup, clearly recognizing the unfairness of the situation, but military protocol demanded obedience to superior officers. He took his position across from Sarah, offering her an apologetic look that she acknowledged with a slight nod. The sparring session began with basic grappling exercises, and immediately it became clear that something was different about Sarah's approach. While Rodriguez relied on his size and strength advantage, Sarah moved with a fluidity and precision that spoke of extensive specialized training. She seemed to anticipate his movements before he made them, flowing around his attacks like water around a stone. Morrison watched with growing frustration as his carefully planned demonstration began to go awry. Sarah wasn't just holding her own against Rodriguez. She was clearly superior in terms of technique and tactical awareness. Each time Rodriguez attempted to use his size advantage, she found ways to neutralize it, using leverage and timing to overcome brute force. "Enough," Morrison barked, stopping the exercise before Rodriguez could be embarrassed further. "Rodriguez, step aside. Apparently, Chen needs a real challenge." Morrison began removing his jacket and rolling up his sleeves, his intentions clear to everyone present. The atmosphere in the training area shifted dramatically as the other instructors and recruits realized that the situation was escalating beyond normal training parameters. This was no longer about military instruction. It had become personal. Sarah watched Morrison's preparations with the same calm demeanor she had maintained throughout their confrontations, but internally she was calculating the potential consequences of what was about to happen. She understood that Morrison's pride and prejudices had driven him to a point where reason no longer applied, and she knew that the outcome of this confrontation would have implications far beyond the training facility. "Let's see how you handle a real opponent," Morrison said as he stepped onto the mat, his size and strength advantages even more pronounced than Rodriguez's had been. At 6'2" and heavily muscled from years of military training, he presented an intimidating figure that would have caused most people to reconsider their position. As Morrison took his stance, Sarah could see the anticipation in his eyes, the confidence born of countless victories over smaller opponents. He had no doubt that this confrontation would end with her humiliation and his vindication. In his mind, the physical reality of their size difference would finally put an end to what he saw as her presumptuous challenge to the natural order. The sparring session began slowly, with Morrison testing Sarah's defenses with increasingly aggressive attacks. Initially, she responded defensively, deflecting his strikes and avoiding his attempts to grapple her to the ground. To the observers, it appeared that she was simply trying to survive the encounter, confirming Morrison's expectations about the outcome. But as the session progressed, subtle changes became apparent to those watching closely. Sarah's defensive movements were too precise, too perfectly timed to be the desperate actions of an overmatched opponent. She was studying Morrison, learning his patterns and identifying his weaknesses with the methodical approach of a professional analyst. Morrison, focused on his overwhelming physical advantage, failed to notice these details. His attacks became more aggressive and less controlled as his confidence grew. He began to incorporate moves that went beyond standard training protocols, using his size to bully Sarah around the mat in ways that made the other instructors exchange concerned glances. "This is what happens when reality meets fantasy," Morrison panted as he pressed his attack, his breathing already becoming labored from the intense pace he had set. "You can pretend to be a soldier all you want, but when it counts, strength and experience always win." Sarah continued her defensive strategy, appearing to struggle against his superior size and strength, while actually gathering information about his fighting style, his preferred techniques, and most importantly, his psychological state. She could see that his frustration was building again, that his need to dominate the situation was overriding his tactical judgment. The moment of crisis was approaching rapidly, and everyone in the facility could sense it. Morrison's attacks were becoming more personal, more vindictive, as if he was trying to settle some deeper grudge through physical dominance. Sarah knew that she would soon be forced to make a choice that would change everything. The tension in the combat training area had reached a breaking point as Morrison's attacks grew increasingly aggressive and personal. What had begun as a training exercise had devolved into something much more dangerous, with Morrison using his superior size and rank to settle what he perceived as a challenge to his authority. The other instructors watched nervously from the sidelines, unsure whether to intervene in what was clearly escalating beyond acceptable limits. Sarah continued her defensive strategy, appearing to struggle under Morrison's relentless assault while actually maintaining perfect control over her positioning and breathing. Her years of specialized training had taught her patience in combat situations, the ability to endure temporary disadvantage while gathering intelligence about her opponent. Morrison's increasingly erratic behavior was providing her with valuable information about his psychological state and tactical weaknesses. "Fight back," Morrison snarled as he pressed another aggressive attack, his frustration evident in his voice. "Stop running and show everyone what you're really made of." His latest combination of strikes came dangerously close to Sarah's head, crossing the line from training into actual assault. The observers could see that Morrison had lost control of the situation, allowing his personal animosity to override his professional judgment. Several of the senior instructors moved closer to the mat, preparing to intervene if the situation deteriorated further. Sarah absorbed a glancing blow to her shoulder and used the momentum to create distance between them. Her movements still controlled despite the increasing intensity of the confrontation. She could see the wild look in Morrison's eyes, the way his technique was deteriorating as his emotions took control. He had moved beyond trying to prove a point and was now simply trying to hurt her. "What's wrong, Chen?" Morrison taunted as he pursued her across the mat, his breathing becoming heavier with each exchange. "This is what real combat looks like. This is what happens when you face someone who won't go easy on you because you're a woman." The verbal assault continued as Morrison launched another series of attacks, each one more aggressive than the last. His strikes were aimed at causing pain rather than demonstrating technique, and his grappling attempts involved using his weight to crush rather than control. The line between training and assault had been crossed completely, and everyone present knew it. Sarah's defensive movements remained precise and efficient, but the observers could see that she was being pushed toward a decision point. Morrison's attacks were becoming dangerous enough that continued defensive action might result in serious injury. Yet fighting back would escalate the situation in ways that could have severe consequences for everyone involved. The moment of crisis arrived when Morrison, frustrated by his inability to land a decisive blow, abandoned all pretense of training protocol. In a move that shocked everyone present, he grabbed Sarah by the shoulders and attempted to slam her to the ground with enough force to cause real injury. The action was clearly outside the bounds of any legitimate training exercise and constituted an outright assault. But as Morrison committed to the attack, expecting to overwhelm Sarah with his superior size and strength, something extraordinary happened. Instead of being driven to the ground as he had anticipated, Morrison found himself moving through empty air as Sarah seemed to simply disappear from his grasp. In one fluid motion, she had slipped his hold, redirected his momentum, and positioned herself behind him while he was still processing what had happened. The speed and precision of the movement was unlike anything the observers had seen before. It wasn't the desperate reaction of an overmatched opponent, but the calculated response of someone with extensive specialized training. Sarah had moved with the efficiency of a professional warrior, demonstrating skills that went far beyond what would be expected from a basic military recruit. Morrison, confused and off balance, spun around to face Sarah, his expression shifting from confidence to uncertainty. For the first time since the confrontation had begun, for a brief moment he caught a glimpse of something in her eyes that made him pause. A cold, calculating look that spoke of capabilities he hadn't anticipated. But his pride and anger quickly overwhelmed his momentary doubt. "Lucky move," he growled, his breathing now labored from exertion and frustration. "Let's see you try that again." Morrison launched himself at Sarah with renewed aggression, throwing caution aside in his determination to re-establish dominance. But this time his attack encountered resistance that he hadn't expected. Sarah no longer moved purely defensively but began to respond with controlled counterattacks that demonstrated a level of skill that shocked everyone present. Her strikes were precise and devastating in their efficiency, targeting pressure points and vulnerable areas with surgical accuracy. She moved like someone who had been trained not just to fight, but to neutralize threats quickly and completely. The difference between her previous defensive posture and her current capabilities was so dramatic that it seemed like she had been replaced by an entirely different person. Morrison found himself being systematically dismantled by an opponent he had completely underestimated. His size and strength advantages meant nothing against someone who moved with such precision and tactical awareness. Each of his attacks was anticipated and countered, while Sarah's responses landed with increasing frequency and effect. The observers watched in stunned silence as the tables turned completely. Morrison, who had entered the confrontation expecting easy domination, now found himself struggling to keep up with an opponent whose capabilities far exceeded anything he had encountered before. His confidence crumbled as he realized that he was outmatched not just in technique, but in every aspect of combat effectiveness. Sarah's movements flowed together in combinations that spoke of years of intensive training, in disciplines that went far beyond basic military instruction. She demonstrated knowledge of pressure points, joint manipulation, and tactical positioning that would have been impressive in a seasoned Special Forces operator, let alone a supposed basic training recruit. As Morrison's attacks became more desperate and less coordinated, Sarah began to take control of the engagement. She moved with the confidence of someone who had faced real combat situations and emerged victorious, someone for whom this level of confrontation was merely routine training rather than a life-threatening encounter. The atmosphere in the training facility had shifted dramatically as everyone present began to realize that they were witnessing something extraordinary. This wasn't a training exercise gone wrong. It was the revelation of capabilities that changed everything they thought they knew about Sarah Chen. The question now wasn't whether she belonged in the military, but what secrets she had been hiding and why. The transformation in the combat dynamics was so dramatic that the entire training facility seemed to hold its breath. Morrison, who moments before had been the dominant aggressor, now found himself completely outclassed by someone he had dismissed as weak and unsuitable for military service. Sarah's movements had evolved from purely defensive to a controlled display of combat expertise that left no doubt about her true capabilities. Morrison's breathing was becoming ragged as he struggled to comprehend what was happening. Every attack he launched was anticipated and countered with surgical precision. Sarah moved around him like she was reading his intentions before he formed them, her responses flowing together in combinations that demonstrated years of elite-level training. The confidence that had carried him through countless confrontations was evaporating as he faced the reality that he was completely outmatched. "What the hell?" Morrison gasped as another of his attacks was effortlessly deflected and followed by a counterstrike that left him momentarily stunned. The precision of Sarah's movements was unlike anything he had encountered, even during his most advanced military training. She fought with the efficiency of someone who had been trained to neutralize threats quickly and permanently. Sarah's expression remained calm and focused as she continued to demonstrate capabilities that went far beyond anything expected from a basic training recruit. Her strikes targeted specific pressure points with anatomical precision. Her defensive movements flowed with practiced ease, and her tactical positioning showed an understanding of combat dynamics that could only come from extensive real-world experience. The observers watched in stunned silence as Morrison's superior size and strength proved meaningless against Sarah's technical superiority. She used his aggression against him, redirecting his momentum and turning his own force into weapons against him. Each exchange further revealed the vast difference between Morrison's conventional military training and Sarah's specialized expertise. Morrison's attacks became increasingly desperate as his frustration mounted. He had built his reputation on physical dominance and intimidation, but those tools were useless against someone who moved with such tactical awareness. His strikes missed their targets while Sarah's responses landed with increasing frequency and effectiveness, systematically wearing down his defenses. "This isn't possible," Morrison panted, his earlier confidence completely shattered. "You're just a recruit. You can't fight like this." Sarah's response was a fluid combination that left Morrison staggered and off balance, demonstrating once again that his assumptions about her capabilities were completely wrong. She moved with the controlled aggression of a professional warrior, someone who had faced life and death situations and emerged victorious through superior training and tactical awareness. The psychological impact of the reversal was as devastating as the physical demonstration. Morrison's worldview, built on assumptions about gender roles and military hierarchies, was crumbling before his eyes. The person he had targeted for humiliation was revealing herself to be superior in every aspect of combat effectiveness, making his prejudices appear not just wrong but dangerously naive. As the confrontation continued, Sarah began to demonstrate techniques that went beyond conventional military training. Her knowledge of joint manipulation, pressure point attacks, and close-quarters combat tactics indicated specialized training of the highest level. She moved with the confidence of someone who had been trained not just to fight, but to eliminate threats efficiently and completely. Morrison's desperation reached a breaking point as he realized that his reputation and authority were being destroyed in front of his subordinates and peers. In a moment of complete loss of control, he abandoned all pretense of training protocol and launched a vicious attack intended to cause serious injury. rather than demonstrate technique. The attack came with murderous intent, Morrison putting all his strength behind a strike aimed at Sarah's head with enough force to cause significant harm. It was the action of someone who had completely lost control of the situation and was now acting purely from wounded pride and rage. The observers gasped as they realized that the confrontation had escalated to a point where serious injury was imminent. But Morrison's desperate assault never found its target. Sarah moved with lightning speed, slipping the attack and positioning herself for a counterstrike that would end the confrontation decisively. For the first time since the engagement began, her movements carried lethal intent, the controlled response of someone trained to neutralize threats permanently when necessary. Morrison's strike passed harmlessly through the air where Sarah had been standing a fraction of a second before, his momentum carrying him forward into a position of complete vulnerability. He had committed everything to the attack, leaving himself open to retaliation from someone whose capabilities he had finally begun to understand but far too late to change the outcome. Sarah's counterattack was a masterclass in precision and control. Instead of delivering the devastating blow that her positioning and Morrison's vulnerability would have allowed, she pulled back at the last instant, demonstrating a level of restraint that was perhaps more impressive than her fighting skills. The message was clear. She could have ended the confrontation permanently but chose not to. Morrison collapsed to his knees, his strength completely exhausted and his pride shattered beyond repair. The person he had targeted for humiliation had revealed herself to be superior in every way that mattered in combat, while demonstrating enough restraint to avoid seriously injuring him, despite his clear intent to harm her. The training facility remained silent as everyone processed what they had witnessed. Sarah stood over Morrison, her breathing still controlled, and her composure intact despite having just demonstrated capabilities that changed everything the observers thought they knew about military training and gender roles in combat situations. The implications of what had just occurred were staggering. Sarah's performance indicated training and experience that went far beyond anything available through normal military channels. The question now was not whether she belonged in the military, but what specialized unit had trained her and why she was masquerading as a basic recruit in a standard training facility. The silence that followed the confrontation was deafening, broken only by Morrison's labored breathing as he knelt on the training mat, his entire worldview shattered along with his pride. Sarah stood calmly nearby, her composure intact despite having just demonstrated capabilities that went far beyond anything expected from a military recruit. The observers remained frozen in place, struggling to process the implications of what they had witnessed. Commander Patricia Walsh, the facility's senior officer, had been alerted to the escalating situation and arrived just as the confrontation reached its climax. A 30-year veteran with experience in multiple combat zones, Walsh recognized immediately that she was looking at something extraordinary. Sarah's movement patterns, tactical awareness, and combat efficiency indicated training at the highest levels of military specialization. Everyone except Chen and Morrison, "Clear the area immediately," Walsh commanded, her voice carrying the authority of decades in command. The observers filed out reluctantly, understanding that they had witnessed something significant but not yet grasping the full scope of what had been revealed. Morrison struggled to his feet, his face flushed with humiliation and residual anger. The complete reversal of the situation had left him psychologically devastated, unable to reconcile his prejudices with the reality of what had just occurred. His entire identity as a superior officer and dominant fighter had been dismantled by someone he had considered beneath his notice. "Sir, I can explain," Morrison began, but Walsh silenced him with a sharp gesture. Her attention was focused entirely on Sarah, who stood at attention with the same calm demeanor she had maintained throughout the entire ordeal. Walsh's experienced eye could see details that Morrison had missed. The way Sarah's stance indicated readiness for immediate action, the controlled breathing that spoke of extensive stress conditioning, and the alertness that suggested constant tactical awareness. "Chen, approach," Walsh ordered. As Sarah moved forward, Walsh noted the fluid precision of her steps, the way she maintained perfect balance and positioning even in a seemingly casual movement. These were not the characteristics of a basic training recruit, but of someone with extensive, specialized training. "Lieutenant Morrison," Walsh said, without taking her eyes off Sarah, You are dismissed. Report to my office at 0800 tomorrow morning for a disciplinary hearing. Your conduct today was completely unacceptable and will be dealt with accordingly. Morrison's face darkened with additional humiliation, but he recognized the finality in Walsh's tone. He gathered what remained of his dignity and left the training area, his departure marking the end of one phase of his military career and the beginning of another that would be defined by the consequences of his actions today. Once Morrison was gone, Walsh's demeanor shifted subtly. The stern commander's mask remained in place, but her eyes showed a different kind of interest as she studied Sarah more closely. Walsh had served with enough special operations personnel to recognize the signs, and everything about Sarah's performance indicated training at the most elite levels. At ease, Chen, Walsh said, though Sarah's posture remained perfectly controlled. I think it's time we had an honest conversation about who you really are and what you're doing in my training facility. Sarah's expression remained neutral, but Walsh could see the calculation behind her eyes as she weighed her options. The confrontation with Morrison had forced her to reveal capabilities that she had clearly been trying to conceal. And now she faced the challenge of explaining herself to someone with the experience to understand the implications. Ma'am, I'm not sure what you mean, Sarah replied carefully, maintaining her cover story despite the obvious futility of continued deception. Walsh smiled grimly. Chen, I've been in the military for 3 decades. I've worked with Navy SEALs, Army Rangers, Marine Force Recon, and every other special operations unit you can name. What I just witnessed wasn't the performance of a basic training recruit who got lucky. That was the demonstration of someone with years of specialized training at the highest levels. The weight of Walsh's words hung in the air between them. Sarah understood that her careful cover had been blown completely, that continuing to maintain her false identity would only insult the intelligence of someone who clearly understood the military at the deepest levels. The question, Walsh continued, is whether you're going to continue this charade or trust me with the truth about what's really happening here. Sarah's mind raced through the implications of disclosure versus continued deception. Her mission parameters had always included the possibility of exposure, and she had protocols for dealing with such situations. However, Commander Walsh's obvious experience and current position of authority complicated the decision significantly. Ma'am, there are certain operational security considerations that prevent me from discussing some aspects of my background, Sarah said carefully, choosing her words to convey information without explicitly violating her cover protocols. Walsh nodded slowly, recognizing the coded language of someone operating under classified orders. I understand operational security, Chen, but what happened here today creates security risks of its own. Morrison isn't going to simply forget what he witnessed, and neither will the other observers. We need to control this situation before it spirals into something that compromises whatever operation you're really conducting. The commander's understanding of the broader implications impressed Sarah and made her realize that Walsh might be an ally rather than a complication. Someone with Walsh's experience would understand the importance of maintaining operational security while managing the fallout from unexpected exposure. Ma'am, I may need to contact my chain of command before I can provide more detailed information, Sarah said, testing Walsh's willingness to work within the constraints of classified operations. That's exactly what I hoped you would say, Walsh replied with approval. A real recruit would either continue lying or panic at this point. Someone with proper training understands the importance of following established protocols even when the situation becomes complicated. Walsh's response confirmed Sarah's assessment that the commander was someone who could be trusted with sensitive information. Her understanding of operational procedures and willingness to work within established chains of command indicated experience with classified operations and special units. I'll give you access to secure communications, Walsh continued. Contact whoever you need to contact, get the clearances you need to get, and then we'll figure out how to handle this situation properly. In the meantime, Morrison and the other witnesses will be debriefed and sworn to secrecy, pending a full investigation of today's events. Sarah felt a mixture of relief and apprehension as she realized that her cover mission was entering a new phase, one that would require careful navigation of military bureaucracy and operational security protocols. 3 hours later, Sarah sat in Commander Walsh's private office. secure communications equipment humming quietly on the desk between them. The conversation with her actual chain of command had been intense but productive, resulting in a partial lifting of her cover protocols and authorization to share limited operational details with Walsh. The decision had been made to transform a compromised, covert mission into an opportunity for broader military cooperation. Walsh reviewed the classified documents that had been transmitted during Sarah's communication session, her expression growing more serious with each page. The reality of what had been unfolding at her facility was far more complex than she had initially imagined, involving multiple levels of military intelligence and special operations planning that reached the highest levels of the Pentagon. Petty Officer First Class Sarah Chen, Navy SEAL Team 6, Walsh read aloud, her voice carrying new respect as she absorbed the full scope of Sarah's actual credentials. 3 tours in Afghanistan, 2 in Iraq, specialist in counter-terrorism operations and deep cover infiltration, recipient of the Silver Star, Bronze Star with Combat Fee, and Purple Heart. Sarah remained at attention as her true service record was revealed, understanding that this moment represented a fundamental shift in her relationship with Walsh and the training facility. Her cover as a basic recruit had provided valuable intelligence about training protocols and facility security, but that phase of her mission was now complete. Your mission was to assess vulnerabilities in our basic training programs, specifically focusing on security protocols and the potential for enemy infiltration. Walsh continued, reading from the classified briefing materials. The confrontation with Morrison was an unplanned complication that forced early termination of the covert phase. The scope of the operation impressed Walsh, who understood the strategic importance of testing military training facilities for security weaknesses. The fact that a decorated Navy SEAL had been able to infiltrate the program and maintain cover for weeks demonstrated significant vulnerabilities that needed to be addressed at the highest levels. The good news, Walsh said, setting down the documents, is that your mission has already achieved its primary objectives. The intelligence gathered about our procedures, personnel screening, and security protocols will be invaluable for improving training programs across all branches of the military. Sarah relaxed slightly, understanding that the premature exposure of her identity hadn't compromised the overall success of her assignment. The weeks of observation had provided comprehensive data about the facility's operations, and the confrontation with Morrison had actually revealed additional information about how personnel react under stress and uncertainty. However, Walsh continued, we now have to deal with the immediate consequences of what happened today. Morrison and the other witnesses saw capabilities that they can't explain through normal training protocols. Even with security briefings and non-disclosure agreements, there's a risk that rumors could spread and compromise future operations. The challenge of managing the aftermath of exposure was something Sarah had trained for, but the specific circumstances made this situation particularly complex. Morrison's prejudices and wounded pride created additional variables that standard protocols didn't adequately address. Ma'am, my training includes procedures for managing blown cover scenarios, Sarah offered. However, the personal nature of Morrison's antagonism creates complications that may require innovative solutions. Walsh nodded grimly. Morrison is the biggest problem. His ego has been devastated, and people in his psychological state can become unpredictable. He might accept the security briefing and move on, or he might decide that his reputation requires some form of retaliation or revenge. The psychological profile of Morrison that had emerged during the mission made him a particular concern for operational security. His inability to accept challenges to his authority, combined with his prejudicial attitudes, created a volatile combination that could lead to security breaches or other disruptive behavior. I've been authorized to offer Morrison a choice, Walsh continued, consulting another set of documents. He can accept reassignment to a different facility with a clean record and additional training in equal opportunity and harassment prevention, or he can face a formal court-martial for assault and conduct unbecoming an officer. The offer represented a pragmatic approach to managing a difficult situation while maintaining operational security. Morrison's removal from the facility would eliminate the immediate threat he posed, while the alternative of court-martial provided sufficient motivation for his cooperation with security protocols. What about the other witnesses? Sarah asked. understanding that managing multiple sources of potential security leaks required careful coordination. They'll be debriefed individually and sworn to secrecy under national security provisions, Walsh explained. Most of them are career military who understand the importance of operational security. The few who might be problematic will be quietly transferred to positions where they can't cause difficulties. The comprehensive approach to damage control impressed Sarah, who recognized Walsh's experience in managing sensitive situations. The commander's understanding of both operational requirements and human psychology would be crucial for maintaining security while minimizing disruption to normal facility operations. There is one additional complication, Walsh added, her expression becoming more serious. Your performance today was witnessed by several advanced training instructors who have been pushing for expanded special operations training programs. They want to know if your techniques can be incorporated into standard curricula. The request represented an opportunity to transform a security complication into a strategic advantage. Sarah's demonstrated capabilities could potentially be used to improve training programs while maintaining operational security through controlled disclosure of non-classified techniques. Ma'am, I would need specific authorization from my command before sharing any operational techniques, Sarah replied, understanding the importance of maintaining proper protocols even in beneficial situations. That authorization is already being processed, Walsh said with satisfaction. Your command recognizes the value of improving overall military training standards, and they're willing to support a limited training exchange program. The evolution of the situation from security crisis to training opportunity demonstrated the value of experienced leadership in managing complex operational challenges. Walsh's ability to transform complications into advantages would ensure that Sarah's mission continued to provide benefits even after the termination of her covert phase. As the day drew to a close, Sarah reflected on the unexpected turns that had brought her true identity into the open and created opportunities for broader military cooperation. The confrontation with Morrison had been an unwelcome complication, but the skilled management of its aftermath had transformed potential disaster into strategic success. 6 months after the confrontation that changed everything, Sarah stood before a packed auditorium at the Naval War College, delivering a presentation on advanced combat techniques to an audience of senior military officers from all branches of the service. Her transition from covert operative to official instructor had been seamless, her expertise now being shared openly rather than hidden behind a carefully constructed cover identity. The training program that had evolved from the initial security assessment had exceeded all expectations, transforming not only the facility where her cover had been blown, but serving as a model for improvements throughout the military training system. Sarah's techniques were being integrated into curricula across multiple installations, raising the overall standard of combat readiness while maintaining the security of truly classified operational methods. Commander Walsh, now promoted to captain following the success of the innovative training programs, sat in the front row with obvious pride. The partnership that had begun with the management of a security crisis had evolved into one of the most successful training initiatives in recent military history, demonstrating the value of transforming challenges into opportunities for improvement. The key principle, Sarah explained to her audience of colonels, commanders, and senior enlisted personnel, is that effective combat training must prepare personnel for the reality of facing opponents who don't follow conventional patterns. Real threats come in all forms, and our training must reflect that diversity. Her presentation drew heavily on the lessons learned from her infiltration mission, though the specific details of that operation remained classified. The broader principles, however, were applicable across all military training programs and had already shown remarkable results in improving overall readiness and effectiveness. Morrison had chosen reassignment and additional training over court-martial, a decision that had ultimately proven beneficial for everyone involved. His new assignment to a logistics unit better suited his administrative skills, while mandatory counseling and education had helped him address the prejudices that had led to the original confrontation. He had even sent Sarah a formal letter of apology, acknowledging his unprofessional behavior and expressing genuine respect for her service record. The other witnesses to the confrontation had been successfully managed through a combination of security, briefings, and strategic reassignments. Most had embraced the opportunity to be part of an innovative training program, understanding that they had witnessed something significant that would contribute to improving military effectiveness across all services. The broader implications of Sarah's mission had extended far beyond the single facility where her cover had been blown. The vulnerabilities identified in security protocols had led to comprehensive reviews of training programs throughout the military, resulting in improved screening procedures and enhanced operational security measures that strengthened the entire system. Perhaps most importantly, the incident had sparked important conversations about gender roles and capabilities in military service. Sarah's demonstration that physical appearance could be completely deceiving had challenged assumptions and prejudices that had limited the effective utilization of personnel across all branches of the military combat. Effectiveness has nothing to do with size, gender, or appearance, Sarah continued her presentation. It's about training, mental preparation, and the ability to think tactically under stress. Our enemies don't discriminate in their targeting, and we can't afford to discriminate in our preparation. The audience listened intently as Sarah shared tactical insights that had been earned through years of real combat experience. Her credibility, established through demonstrated performance rather than theoretical knowledge, gave weight to concepts that might have been dismissed if presented by someone without her operational background. After the presentation, Sarah was approached by numerous officers seeking additional information about implementing similar training programs at their own facilities. The demand for her expertise had grown to the point where a permanent training cadre was being established to spread the innovations more broadly throughout the military system. Captain Walsh joined Sarah after the crowd had dispersed, both women reflecting on the remarkable journey that had brought them to this point. What had begun as a security assessment and nearly ended in disaster had become a catalyst for positive change throughout the military training system. "You know," Walsh said with a smile, "when I first saw you demolish Morrison's prejudices along with his pride, I knew we were witnessing something special, but I never imagined it would lead to this level of systematic improvement." Sarah nodded, understanding that her mission had achieved far more than its original objectives. Sometimes the best outcomes come from the most unexpected circumstances. Morrison's antagonism forced a revelation that created opportunities we never could have planned. The two women looked out over the now empty auditorium, both aware that their work was contributing to a transformation in military culture that would benefit countless future service members. The incident that had begun with one man's prejudices and ended with his humiliation had become the foundation for progress that extended far beyond any individual personalities or conflicts. As Sarah prepared to travel to her next assignment, training instructors at another facility in the innovative techniques that had emerged from her infiltration mission, she reflected on the complex chain of events that had brought her to this point. A routine security assessment had become a catalyst for change. A moment of personal conflict had become an opportunity for professional growth, and a potential disaster had become a triumph for military effectiveness and equality. The lieutenant had hit her once, driven by prejudice and wounded pride. But in that moment of aggression, he had unknowingly struck a blow against the very assumptions and limitations that had constrained military effectiveness for generations. Sarah's response had been measured and professional, but its impact had been revolutionary, changing not just one training facility but the entire approach to military preparation and equality. The transformation was complete, but the work continued. As Sarah and others like her carried forward the lessons learned from a confrontation that had revealed both the worst and best aspects of military culture, ultimately strengthening the entire system through the honest examination of its weaknesses and the committed pursuit of its highest ideals.